Thank you and good evening. And it was wonderful to see so many people here. And my apologies for I'm the cause of the delay because there was an accident on the Westgate Bridge, which took a long time. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the original owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to thank Anthony and the Eureka Centre for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, invited to give this talk as part of the Eureka Centre's wonderful recognition of the importance of history, and that should always be celebrated. As Anthony said, I'm a labour historian. That means I've devoted my career to telling stories about working people. Tonight I'm here to talk about women's work in pubs, a subject inspired by growing up in a small country town, observing that the businesses, the general store, the post office, and at the town centre the rather unlovely pub, and that was about it for the town, were all run by women, which everyone else took for granted and found unremarkable. How many of you have had someone in your family and your family history who owned, ran or worked in a pub? See, most people, it's very common. Well, me too. I grew up knowing that my great-grandfather had built and run a pub in country New South Wales where we stayed when we were travelling. But I then discovered that even before my great-grandfather, there was his grandmother, and my family story was actually part of a much bigger picture. So tonight I want to make just 3 points about women's work in pubs. It is work that is as old and deeply enmeshed in the colonisation, that is the settler colonialism of Australia. That's my first point. The second point, it was ubiquitous. There were pubs employing women in every colonial community, town, port, mining settlement and transport route, along the roads and rivers and railways of the spaces in between. It was economically important and culturally distinctive, shaped by law, history and Australia's drinking culture. The Australian pub grew as a different beastie from those in England, Scotland and Ireland, a fact which had implications for women. Women needed the work and their work was necessary to the running of the pub. So these factors became fused, and I will deal with each of these points in turn, but they are woven together. So I use images a lot in my work, photographs mainly, but also paintings, not just as illustrations, but as sources or texts that can be analysed. And I want to start with one now. And it's nicely relevant because it's of Ballarat, and I suggested that it be used to advertise this talk. You probably know it well because it's held in the Ballarat Art Gallery. So this is St. Gill, or Samuel Gill's painting of a shanty on the goldfields. It's not what we think of as a pub. You can see it's a temporary dwelling. Nevertheless, it conveys much historical truth about pubs of that era, which Gill also pursued in his other works. It is valuable as an interior and suggests a space of conviviality and sociability. There is only one room. Early pubs did not actually have separate rooms for drinking and dining. Drinking here is done standing up or by sitting with others at 1 or 2 long tables, also used by people wanting to eat. And that's how it was done in English inns, at shared tables, everybody eating whatever meal the innkeeper provided on that day. There was no choice. And it was how it was now done in the colonies. But there is a small counter to the side, serving counter, where a woman is standing serving. That is not the long counter separating customers from the proprietor or serving staff that's seen in this image from the later pubs. That was a feature to come later. We can see similar aspects to Gill's shanty portrayed in a view of another interior, the Shamrock, the mining exchange in the large hall of the Shamrock Hotel of Bendigo. This was done by Samuel Calvert and is held by the State Library of Victoria. We know the Shamrock was and still is a very substantial building, but it was originally built in 1854 as a more humble abode, which subsequently grew grand. This image demonstrates how colonial pubs not only grew grander, but they had many uses. They were theatres, as the Shamrock was. They had ballrooms. They provided all kinds of community services, meeting rooms for town councils and clubs, grounds for fairs, dining rooms for banquets and weddings, and cool rooms for the town morgue. They were used for coronial inquests. They were absolutely central to a town's life. So in this Shamrock image, the main thing this image conveys is the overwhelming numerical dominance of men, as well as their prosperity and busyness. This reflects the demographic reality of Australian colonial life. In the convict era, men outnumbered women 7-1, a ratio which only reduced slowly and took until 1900 before it normalised, remaining higher in the bush than it was in the towns, and in some colonies more than others. Here too, Here too, the solitary woman is there supplying the drink. Like Gill's painting, she too is off to the side at a small counter. We can really only see her head. This is actually a man standing here. That's her head behind him. In neither image is she the centrepiece of the painting. The focus is on the clientele. The story is about men's activity, their life on the goldfields, becoming prosperous, fueling the economy. And that is how history is usually written. But we can read these images for their portrayal of women's work, as also contributing importantly to the economy, providing service, selling necessary refreshment and nourishment. Gill is not depicting the serving woman as glamorous. The barmaid, an occupation that came into existence in the middle decades of the 19th century and did become the subject of artworks such as Edward Manet's famous painting of the bar at the Folies Bergère, painted in 1881. As the Australian pub took on a national character associated with its beer drinking culture, women working behind the bar were celebrated and actively promoted as this character of the barmaid, which we can see here in this ad for Foster's Lager. And also seen here in this photo of the Crown Call of Ballarat, one of the first interior photographs that was taken. So it's more real than an advertisement. But she is the focus of this image, leaning on a small counter, just like the other two, like in the advertisement, in fact. But what is being depicted here is her workplace. And the welcome sign, which you probably can't read, down here saying welcome, which is inviting customers in. So these images come from colonial Australia. It was an agricultural, pastoral and mining economy. Outdoor work was not available to women, and not just because of their physical differences. You may be surprised to know that once men and women did do the same heavy physical work in the fields, growing and harvesting food in the Middle Ages in Britain and Europe, seen in this image here. But by the time colonists were arriving in New South Wales in larger numbers, it was not customary. Women could not go down the mines. It was by a law passed in England in 1840, and by custom in other work, shearing sheep or driving trains and loading ships, taking wool and wheat to market, and that's my current research project. This exclusion became entrenched in national identity, as was shown in this painting by Tom Roberts, done in 1890, painting women out of the story of Australia's history, concentrating on representing men's physical labour, and even the girl in the centre here, he has portrayed as a boy. He has made her the centre. I think there's probably something significant there, but I won't go into it now. Women's work was to be in shops, or teaching children, or in laundries, or sewing garments, mostly as domestic servants for other families in larger households, or institutions like hospitals, asylums, and orphanages, and in hotels, providing food and refreshment and lodging. Given the variation between the location, the size, and the standards of the pubs, there was wide variation in the nature and conditions of the work and workplaces. And this, of course, changed as the colonies grew over time. So that is our story, placing women as workers and writing their experience into Australia's history, giving us, I hope, a fresh perspective. So, my point one. What we can say is that women's work in pubs is deeply enmeshed in Australia's colonial history, from the earliest years of colonisation. The first licence to sell alcohol was given in 1792, just 4 years after the first fleet arrived, to two men, one of whom was Thomas Reeby. So while, got to turn the page. While Reeby ran a successful trading business, it was his wife Mary who actually ran the pub and general store, and that became a pattern for many couples. During a long widowhood, she built up a sizable fortune. 5 years later, the first licence was issued directly to a woman, and 2 years later, there were two more. So they were small numbers, but there weren't many women in the colony, as I said, and that was the beginning of a sprinkling, about a fifth of all licences that were regularly awarded to women. And my ancestor, Mary Plowright, was one of them. She was transported to the colony in 1809. A little over 2 years later, she had received a pardon, and in 1815 she applied for and was granted a licence. Unfortunately, I don't have any images of her, but this sketch by George Roberts of the Dove and Olive Branch in Sydney in 1845, although it is a much later period, does give us an indication of what many of the early pubs would have looked like. It's essentially a home, and the solitary person in the image, Anne Bushby, is a woman, arms open, inviting the man standing outside to come in. There's no record of an Anne Bushby in Sydney town in this period, and we know nothing about these two people. He seems reluctant, but why is he loitering there unless he has no money and needs a meal? We do know that with the overabundance of men among the convicts, few of them were able to marry and have the domestic service provided by women or to have families, and hence the need for lodging houses. But notice the sign, I don't know if you can see it, but up here on the roof, it says, selling Australian beer. What we see here is both a continuation of English heritage and adaptation to conditions in the colony. There was nothing new about women selling beer. It began in the Middle Ages when they produced beer as part of the family diet. If they had a surplus, they would stick a broom handle outside to indicate they were selling, and this was the start of the English pub, or the alehouse. The alehouse was different from the inn, catering to travellers by providing food and lodging, or taverns in the towns that were selling wine. These three versions of the English pub, which grew according to what alcohol they served, what locale they were in, and to whom they were selling, was consolidated in the colonies under colonial conditions. The early colony of New South Wales had a problem with the widespread consumption of hard liquor. You'll remember the stories of the rum corps. The early governors wanted to break that dependence on rum and also to develop agriculture, so they encouraged the growing of hops to make beer. The governors also issued the liquor licences, which gave them some control of the amount of rum that was being drunk. Governor Macquarie arrived in 1810 and decided that there were too many public houses providing drink for the few number of colonists, and he refused to renew some licences for being too bawdy rather than respectable hotels. And my ancestor, Mary Plowright, was among them. Her establishment was too close to the barracks where the soldiers were housed. However, she managed to get her licence reinstated a year later and went on to become a wealthy woman, owning several properties and more than one pub in the centre of Sydney and Pitt Street by the time she died in 1825. Mary was a mother. She left behind 6 children in England when she was convicted and transported to New South Wales, and in the colony she had another child, married and quickly separated from her husband, so she was raising a child on her own and needing a source of independent income. So running a pub was a good option. The other big change that Governor Macquarie made was to pass a law making selling liquor dependent on provision of food and accommodation, thus making them more like the English inns. This was to cater for the needs of travellers as colonisation spread beyond the area around Sydney and the coaching trade began. Here we see Mitchell's Hotel, which is in Mount Gambier. Transport by horse-drawn coach was slow and difficult over rough terrain and long distances in the heat of the Australian summer or the cold wet of winter. Both passengers and drivers needed overnight accommodation and numerous stops along the way for refreshment and toilet breaks. The horses too had to be stabled, fed and watered, which the licensing laws also required the pub to provide. So all up and down the roads, pubs were built to provide the refreshments for coach passengers or those waiting to be ferried across rivers by a punt. And the same process happened when the railways came. Facilities may have been crude or very basic, but pubs offered critical services that facilitated colonisation. Towns were sometimes no more than service centres based upon a hotel, a blacksmith and a wheelwright to repair local and passing vehicles, and a shop or two. Sometimes these were all one building, as indicated here in this painting of Mitchell's. See next to it, painted in 1856. This is the same period as Gill's painting, but this is a substantial establishment, which I found, again about Ballarat connection, sitting in the family garage of the family that had moved from Mount Gambier and had taken the painting with them. Mitchell's also ran the store. I don't know if you can see how clear that is, but that's Mitchell's store and Heineman's saddlery next to it. For all those horses that you can see in the image as well. This painting, though, also shows the dispossession of Aboriginal families from their land, the foundation on which settler colonialism was based. And that's a subject we could say a lot more about, as the colonies also started passing laws restricting Indigenous peoples' movements and their access to pubs. Having to provide accommodation and meals to all comers, locals and visitors, importantly required women's labour as their domestic skills and experience. Women, though, also brought business acumen, seeing pubs as providing an opportunity for economic independence, as Mary Plowright did. And I love this image. This photo was taken in 1867, the same year as the Menzies Grand Hotel was opened in Melbourne, the same year as the first licence was issued, which leads me to think she must be the holder of the licence, proudly, determinedly, definitely, standing in front as proprietor of her own business. It's not a grand building, more than a house, barely more than a house, a wooden construction with a front room, when in this post-gold rush era, these timber-framed weatherboard pubs were being replaced by stone and brick buildings with verandas reaching to the edge of the road, more in keeping with Ballarat and Bendigo's more established permanent prosperity. City pubs were reaching to 4 floors with balconies and featuring fashionable curved corrugated iron. And the Menzies was providing accommodation and meals to the well-to-do and sometimes visiting aristocracy. The Pennyweight is definitely not in that league. It has no verandas or wrought iron and seemingly no additional staff. The licensee is alone with just a small dog. Her posture, no nonsense, standing solidly planted on her 2 feet, her dress and demeanour speaking of a life of hard work and little spare cash. There are no luxuries in sight, either in the hotel fixtures or in her dress. It is not a prosperous, fashionable establishment and seems not to have been positioned on a busy road, a city corner or other prominent site. But it is definitely a hotel and a means of providing a lone woman with a hard-earned living. And we can get a sense of how important this work was for women in this and these many other photos. These are from Gympie in Queensland just a few years later. Same weatherboard frame construction, but note the absence of men and the prevalence of children. Their husbands were either working elsewhere or these women were deserted wives or widows, raising children on their own. Desertion was very high in the colonial period because the nature of work required mobility and men were away for long periods, coming home sometimes, as in this painting by Frederick McCubbin, or not at all. The rate of desertion was made worse by the gold rush, although there were women on the goldfields and selling alcohol either as sly grog or legitimately as shown in Gill's paintings. For mothers raising children, a pub was both a business and a place to live. It was a public house and a private home. Providing a home away from home for customers and travellers, but very importantly, a means of women combining childcare and paid work that became a constant feature of the industry well into the late 20th century. The children could provide some of the labour, making beds, waiting on tables, and as they got older, serving behind the bar. And this way, sons and daughters learnt skills which meant that later they could become licensees themselves. So this was my great-grandfather's pub story. He was a carpenter by trade, and in 1869 he built an extension onto his home, which became the hotel. 10 years later, he acquired more land and built this, Criterion Hotel, in 1924. This is a photo of it in 1924. He built it by 1882. It was a 2-storey establishment with balconies, 34 bedrooms, 2 large dining rooms, 4 lounge bars, a music room, and other rooms for commercial travellers to do business, with laundry facilities and servants' quarters at the rear. So these images from later, from a different pub, suggest what my great-grandfather's pub might have looked like inside. And this is how grand some of those balconies could be. So while in my family's recounting of this history, great-grandfather Frederick is given the glory, it seems indeed that it was my great-grandmother Charlotte who was the driving force behind the hotel's success. Their 2 daughters died in childhood, drowned in the river. So it was their second son, they had 4, who was very involved in helping his mother and learning the business, and who took over the licence on his father's death. This is him seated next to his mother Charlotte in the bottom corner there, and standing behind him is my grandfather, son number 3, and the hero of my side of the family story. But what I'm trying to say is the women are definitely left out. The Criterion, like many hotels, was bought by a brewery, Tooth's, in 1904, and it became a tide house, selling only that brewery's beer. And that is why I now have access to the archive of my family's pub. And this 1969 photo of the building that I recall from my childhood. The original building was destroyed by fire in the 1930s, and this one too was finally destroyed by fire just recently in 2017. So the significance of this story is also that for most of the 20th century, many pubs were tied, and Tooths has left an amazing archive collection of all these pubs. The breweries preferred to have women running the pub. So the tied house system was one reason there were many women working in pubs well beyond colonial times. Which brings me to my second point. At pubs were ubiquitous and women's work was. Pubs, as I've said, were located in every colonial community, town, port, mining settlement and transport route. They were also on every city street corner and the blocks in between. And at one point, the calculation was that there was one pub for every 250 people in the colony. That meant they were also local and often within walking distance of homes and neighbourhoods. In other words, it was relatively easy for women to get to work. By the close of the 19th century, barmaids, attendants and servants of various kinds in hotels and inns made up the largest group of wage earners in the census. In New South Wales and Victoria, women outnumbered men working for wages behind the bar, especially in the cities, and also worked as chambermaids or cooks or waitressing staff in the hotel dining room. So that requirement to provide accommodation and meals, which stayed in the licensing laws until almost the end of the 20th century, continued to draw women to the workforce. And they were both the employers and the wage-earning staff. Usually, hotels were, like my family's, a family-owned business. And even in the late 20th century, even almost 3/4 of all pubs were family-owned small businesses, employing less than 20 people. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, licensing authorities sometimes required a male publican to have a wife or daughter who could provide the housekeeping skills needed to run the pub. So licences were often shared, given to husband and wife, but they were also given to women alone. And sometimes the police were known to run husbands out of town so their wives could get on with running the pub. By the 1890s, well over half the women employers that were named in the census were hotel keepers. And in the early 20th century, women ran more than half the pubs in metropolitan Melbourne. So here we have one of these women. She's actually the proprietor of a private hotel in Hobart. And this is the 1930s, but her fur coat is demonstrating her prosperity and her business success. And probably the most famous of all Australian women publicans is swimming great Dawn Fraser, seen here in 1979 behind the bar of her hotel in the Sydney inner suburb of Balmain, where she grew up. So running a pub was very much determined by the law. Licensing laws controlled the hours of opening and thus the rhythms of the workday. Laws created space where food had to be consumed, that is dining rooms, accommodation had to be provided, the residential areas, where higher prices could be charged, the saloon bar, where only travellers could drink on a Sunday, and women drank in the mixed lounge or the specially designated ladies' lounge on rickety chairs and small tables. Licensing laws, which had brought in early closing in Victoria in 1916, also said women could not be employed to work behind the bar unless they were family members, although those already employed could continue, but they had to be registered. Work in the pub was divided between front of house, receiving guests and serving food and liquor to public customers in the bar and dining room, and back of house, where the cooking, laundering and cleaning the residential accommodation occurred. In the smaller family pubs, members of the family undertook most of the work and employed additional staff where needed. It's interesting to see in many photos, the women are always grouped upstairs and the men downstairs where the bar is. Housemaids were usually young girls, carrying buckets of water, heavy bundles of linen up and down several flights of stairs and cleaning up messy bedrooms. Cleanliness was always the overwhelming task in pub work, both in the bar and kitchen, but also throughout the hotel. Cleanliness of floors and walls, gleaming and grime-free cooking, eating and drinking spaces was essential in attracting and keeping business and ensuring the public were not exposed to health risks. And most of this work was washing, polishing, scrubbing and sweeping. The wage-earning staff often lived in because hours were very long. Colonial licensing laws allowed pubs to open sometimes as early as 4 a.m. and to close as late as midnight, meaning these young women could be working 14 or 16-hour days. A royal commission in Victoria in the early 1880s found that barmaids were shamefully overworked under insanitary conditions, and they were subjected to hardships more severe and physically distressing than any other class in the community. In the 20th century, early closing meant hours were shorter, but employers still preferred having their employees living in. It was not very satisfactory for the workers, though, where 5 women might be crowded into an impossibly small, stuffy space. And even in the later 20th century, there were women bar workers complaining that they had inadequate facilities and had to change in a corridor leading to the men's toilet. Wages were paid on the assumption that board and lodging were included, which was not good for married women and working mothers who lived out. While additional staff were needed, smaller hotels usually employed 1 or more assistants as general servants to divide their work between the bar and the back of house according to demand. And this made women attractive as employees because men, according to one publican in 1916, quote, cannot or will not do the housework usually done by women during the slow trading hours in the bar. So the more elaborate a hotel, the more differentiated its staff would be. In larger establishments with grander dining rooms, men occupied the jobs at the top of the hierarchy as chefs and head waiters, though kitchen maids and housemaids were sometimes able to progress to positions as waitresses and cooks as they gained experience and if they stayed in the work long enough. So in the kitchen, young women often started at 14 working as kitchen hands. But while the licence to sell liquor and selling beer was the most profitable function of the pub, the kitchen was often where a pub's reputation could be made or lost. It was the crux and the pivot of the whole establishment, the heart of our industry, especially as hotels were increasingly catering to a new sort of traveller, the tourist. Staffing of the kitchen may have been no more, as it was here, the licensee herself or a short order cook. They worked in kitchens that were full of smoke from wood-burning stoves, had poor drainage, water spilled on the floor, and were draughty. Because there was no running hot water, staff had to carry scalding water in buckets. Injuries to backs and burns or scalds were serious hazards, especially before electrical appliances proliferated in the 1950s. And apart from the usual hygiene issues that food and drink retailers must necessarily observe, beer selling demanded additional levels of cleanliness because beer needed clean pipes and glasses to form a collar or head, the best indicator of the quality of the beer. And as publicans were frequently reminded by their breweries, the quality of the beer was what made drop-in customers into regulars. And here in this photo is probably the licensee serving her regulars, who were the locals. Discerning, you can see, these discerning, experienced drinkers were known to bypass pubs with inferior product and walk long distances to get the best brew served. Consequently, bar work required cleaning of countertops, cabinets, tables, and especially glassware. The beer taps needed to be spotless, and all soap and fat residue from fish and chips, etc., had to be removed from drinking utensils, which was a nightmare until automatic dishwashers were introduced. Rules for bar staff posted up in Brisbane's leading hotel in 1952 give a good indication of employer expectations of their front of house staff and why women were often preferred. Employers frequently said women were more honest than men. And the first rule of the pub was honesty. Tills were not to be inconsistent. The second rule was honesty. Employees were not to shout the customers or give away any of the hotel's goods. And the third rule was honesty. Staff were neither to rob the customer nor their employer by buying their personal popularity in the bar. So rules 4, 5 and 6 related to cleanliness that I've just talked about. Rules 7 to 11 covered relationships with customers, being courteous and deferential. Rule 12 was the knowledge of goods. Rule 13 was about personal cleanliness and general appearance. Bar and all kitchen and serving staff were forbidden to smoke and were required to be clean and healthy and free from contagious disease. Rules 14 and 15 were about avoiding waste, because in making profits for the employers, you earned your own wages. And Rule 16 was that every employee must work amicably with everybody else. So this last was particularly relevant in small businesses employing only a small workforce, which I said most of them were. Okay, so that brings me to my third point, which is the history of hotels, and tying hotels to breweries, and law also shaped the work in other ways. 6 o'clock closing, which was brought in to reduce drinking during World War I, lasted 50 years and created a distinctive Australian drinking culture. Only men drank in the public bar. This is Bondi Pub, Saturday morning in the 1950s. The barmaid was the only woman allowed in there, sometimes working alongside men, sometimes on her own. So serving men customers meant assessing, and I quote, assessing all kinds of men, according to the Hoteliers magazine in 1948, was a definite characteristic of her skills. And we can get a sense of the reality of work behind the bar during this era from these photographs taken by that prominent Australian photographer Max Japan in the 1940s. Here in this photograph of Scott's Hotel, we can see up the top the length of the bar that was needed to cater for the large crowds of after-work city drinking. And here, and this one, Japan has, very interestingly, gone behind the bar to show the conditions of work there. And you can see that's a man here and a woman working alongside each other, and there's beer spilled on the floor, and they're walking up and down endlessly. Very tiring work. So the 1950s brought a lot of attention to Australia's uncivilised drinking culture as Australia prepared to host the Olympic Games. And the eastern states tried to change their laws. This was a flyer put out in Victoria encouraging people to civilise the drinking custom. An iconic painting of the pub in this decade is John Brack's painting of the bar, painted in 1954. It's probably one you're very familiar with. It does not glamorise the Australian pub drinking culture or the barmaid, as Manet did in 1881. And Brack believed Manet would never have painted an Australian bar. In his work, the barmaid is older, grim-faced, standing before a mirror reflection of intense, dour, white-collar workers downing their last drinks during the 6 o'clock swill in a suburban pub. Praised by reviewers at the time for revealing a world familiar to us all, it has become a major representation of an infamous aspect of post-war pub culture. But I note it was painted a year after The Story of Caddy was published, which was an autobiographical story of a Sydney barmaid, co-written with teacher and novelist Dymphna Cusack, when professional middle-class women, journalists for example, were claiming the right to drink in pubs too. Cusack saw Caddy's story of her working experience as a way to change the licensing laws, then being investigated by a royal commission in New South Wales. So while New South Wales succeeded in civilising its laws in 1954, Victoria, host of the Olympic Games 2 years later, failed and had to wait another decade. But when it did come, the end of 6 o'clock closing also changed the work opportunities for younger women. So the age of barmaids also significantly changed. Another reason women were drawn to pub work was that it was better paid than other women's work. From the beginning of the 20th century, with the establishment of industrial tribunals, Hotel work was covered by awards which set maximum hours of work per day and per week and stipulated the minimum wages to be paid. Unions were organised around the different work. Back of house, kitchen, dining room and cleaning staff organised into catering and waiters unions, but front of house bar staff organised into the liquor trades union, along with the maltsters and brewery workers, that is, male workers, who usually had more bargaining power with employers. And this was a good tactical move, because the liquor trade union fought for and won them better conditions, shorter, more regular hours, and got women equal pay. In 1910 in Western Australia, in Victoria in 1950, and everywhere else in 1968. So, working women could too be very militant. So, in the late 20th century, although alcohol was now available through other retail outlets, bottle shops, supermarkets and licensed restaurants, dramatically reduced the number of pubs, they were still workplaces for a large proportion of the labour force. The majority of hotel workers were still women, but fewer were full-time. So an underlying theme of my talk tonight has been the representation of pub work against its reality, which had meaning for the experience of workers. And here is an image that I want to end with, which captures the often invisible reality of the service that pubs provided to generations of Australians, but it's not drinking or dining. This is not the architecturally impressive front, but the functional back of the pub, the hotel yard, where the steps enabled residents, and I remember this from my childhood, carrying heavy luggage upstairs. And look at these men. One is occupied checking on the engine, perhaps refilling the radiator from the water tank nearby. The other looks like he's heading hurriedly to the gents rather than the advertised afternoon tea. And now leap forward a century, and I want to leave you with this image by an aged newspaper cartoonist referencing John Brack's work to represent our first woman Prime Minister. Pub work had huge cultural significance, and the barmaid, it seems, is lingering powerfully in Australia's culture. Thank you.